And I will say, like, I grew up, so my family's from Puerto Rico,
Mhm.
but I grew up only speaking Spanish at home and then English
Yep,
everywhere else. So it wasn't until
same.
I got to DC that with DC United that then I was like exposed to Argentinians and like all these other people. And I'm like, listen to all these accents. I was like, I can't understand what anyone's saying. I was
I
only
know.
used to one accent, and that's Puerto Rico.
Yes. My first year we signed, so I had players from Cuba, Colombia, and Costa Rica and Ecuador when I first started. All of those accents I was relatively accustomed to. Those were fine. We signed a 17-year-old kid from Uruguay. I'd never heard that accent before. I was like, I don't understand what this child is saying. I don't understand what this kid is saying. I would replay the audios over and over and over again because I couldn't pick out the words. It took me like a month to be able to confidently be like, yes, that is what this kid is saying. I can translate for him appropriately now.
It's it's so difficult, and it's
It's
like those points where like Spanish is already my second language,
Mhm.
and you know, obviously my English obviously is the best because that's my native language, is what I
Yep.
use more often than Spanish. So like there are points where I've already doubted my Spanish,
Mhm.
and then I get to the point where then I'm speaking with players from other countries, and then I doubt it even more because like you said, like I'm like, I am supposed to be fluent in Spanish, and I say that
Yep.
I'm fluent in Spanish, but then I come across a player and someone's like, "Hey, what did they say?" I'm like, "I have no freaking clue."
Yep.
And like people don't understand that like it's different dialects. Like the way that I always describe
Yes.
Spanish is because people are like, "Oh, you speak Spanish, you can speak to anyone." I'm like, "Listen, there are certain words that like might be a bad word in Puerto Rico, but people out there are using like on a daily basis or like vice versa, and I use random words that people are like, I don't know what you're saying." So then I'm like, am I not fluent in Spanish?
Yep.
Like, I mean, how did you? Because that's one of the biggest things is like, I kind of feel like an imposter sometimes where I'm like, I'm not actually
Yes.
Latina. Like, I can't speak Spanish. And it's like, no,
Yep.
like, shut up. You actually can. Like,
Yes.
did you deal with stuff like
Yes.
that? And like, sometimes think maybe I shouldn't even be speaking Spanish.
Yes. Especially when I started, I remember like so clearly. I had to do so I have a few stories, but this first one when I first started, I had to do an interview with Ozzy Alonso.
Uh huh.
He was like one of like five major signings heading into the 2019 season for Minnesota United. And I quickly realized that it was better for him to do them in Spanish than in English just because his English just wasn't that great.
Yeah.
And so I thought I was going to be behind the camera asking him these questions. They throw me in front of the camera. I'm sure if you went to the Minnesota United YouTube and like dug deep into 2019, you will find me in one of these videos. And it was like the first time I ever really had to talk to him. And I knew what a big deal he was. And I was still like a little starstruck just in general to be around the athletes because it'd been a long time.
Yeah.
And I wanted to do so well. And there was the Spanish language aspect of it. And it is horrendous. Like just a terrible, terrible interview. And when I get nervous, I stutter.
Uh
And
huh.
sometimes when you're trying to flip flop back and forth between languages, my brain sort of freezes and then I stutter. I sort of get choked up on a word. And I've always been really self conscious of that because it feels like to the outside world that I don't know the language as well as I'm supposed to. When in
Yeah.
reality, it's actually really difficult to flip flop between languages. And it's a
It's
lot of work for your brain to do. And
yeah.
sometimes that's how it presents itself. But I'm still like, it's still super, it feels really embarrassing because like you said, we're talking to guys who speak the language fluently and they expect us to translate to them in Spanish and from Spanish to
Yeah.
English, but sometimes it takes us a little longer. Or and with Ozzy, because he knew English, he would be a little bit more critical, be like, hey, that's not exactly what I said, let's try and fix this together.
Ah.
um, and then a few years later, I had a player who he was not kind, and he at one point, I can't remember exactly what he said, but he said it in front of all of the guys, all of the Hispanic group of guys, and basically made a comment making fun of me for my Spanish and that my Spanish wasn't very good. And I was so mad. I was so mad. It felt so disrespectful. And I was like, there's also no way that this man would have said this to me if I wasn't.
Yeah. Oh, 100%.
And then he said it in front of all of the other players. And it was so embarrassing. I was so mad. I remember calling my boss and being like, I don't know what to do. This guy doesn't respect me, blah, 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 blah. And then we traded him and it was the best thing ever. But it hurt because it was like the one thing that I've always been self-conscious about. And he pinpointed it and he said it out loud and he said it in front of many people. And it hurt.